The first thing I heard was the scrape of heels against old oak and a laugh that cut like glass. Jessica leaned toward her mother, lips curled, and let her contempt spill in a whisper meant to travel. When Michael limped through the doorway, bracing himself on the wooden crutch that had become his second spine, she didn't even bother to lower her voice. The word she used wasn't a word so much as a verdict unfit tossed into the stale air of Department 12 like a scrap for the wolves. The courtroom smelled of wax and dust, a museum of other people's wars. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, drawing hard white bars across the floor. Reporters idled near the back, their pens and cameras held like small, impatient weapons. Neighbors sat with the stiff curiosity of people who swear they don't enjoy gossip and secretly live on it. And then the door behind the bench opened, and Judge Stephen Morales entered. The room fell into the hush that follows thunder. He took his seat with the practiced economy of a man who has sat in judgment of 1,000 sorrows. His eyes made a slow-circuit bailiff, clerk, counsel, then settled on Michael with a brief, human flicker I almost mistook for pity. But when his gaze traveled past my son and found me, just me, an older woman with an old leather briefcase, the world inside his eyes shifted. Recognition struck like a match. His mouth tightened, the mask of routine slipped. For an instant he looked young, startled as if some long-buried rumor had just stood up in front of him and breathed. "Why are you here?" he asked, not from the bench, not with gavel. Steady authority, but in a low, involuntary breath that did not belong to a judge so much as a man who had seen a ghost. Wood creaked. A rustle moved through the gallery. Jessica's brother glanced at her, her father's jaw tensed. Even the clerk's pen paused mid-scratch. I set my briefcase down on the counsel table with a sound that cracked the silence like a knuckle. The leather was scarred and honest. It smelled of ink and long nights. It had held contracts and confessions, affidavits and middle-of-the-night courage. Today it held the last of my patience and the first of our hope. I didn't answer him. Not yet. I slid into the chair beside my son. His hand, cold and damp, found the back of mine and clung there, bone whispering against bone. Beneath the table I could feel the tremor in his leg, the work it cost him just to be upright in a world that had taken height away from him. I breathed in the simple fact of us mother and son and let it anchor me. Across the aisle, Jessica adjusted the hem of her red dress Gucci, the color of a stop sign you run when you think the road belongs to you. Her lipstick shone like a fresh wound. She crossed one leg over the other and began tapping the heel of her shoe against the floor. Tap, tap, tap. Every strike a tiny hammer announcing the ceremony she believed this would be. The unmaking of a man, the division of a home, the quiet demolition of a life. Her lawyer, Jennifer Rivers, rose with a smoothness I knew too well, posture like a blade, voice trained not to waver. She stacked motions and exhibits on the table, as if assembling a miniature wall between truth and consequence. I watched her from a distance that measured years as much as feet. Once, we had shared stale coffee and unruly dreams in the same hallway outside a different courtroom. We had promised ourselves that the law could be a lantern, not a cudgel. Time had taught us how easily hands change when they hold power. "All rise," the bailiff called, though we already had. We rose again anyway, performing the ritual obedience that makes courts run. When the judge signaled us to sit, the benches exhaled like old lungs. The sound of pages turning lifted and fell like the wings of trapped birds. "Call the matter," Judge Morales said, voice steady now, public again. The clerk read our names into the record, syllables that should have been ordinary but felt like flint striking steel. I listened to the formalities, the case number, the caption, the schedule, as if I were listening to the weather report before a hurricane. Beside me, Michael's breath hitched. I slid my thumb over his knuckles, a small, stubborn comfort. "Your Honor," Jennifer began, "this is a straightforward dissolution. My client, Mrs. Jessica Torres, seeks a clean division of assets acquired during the marriage, including half the value of the marital residence. We will also address custody, as Mr. Villaseñor's current medical limitations render him." The word burden wasn't yet out of her mouth before it was alive between us, a snake uncoiling. I saw it stain Michael's face. I saw it feed Jessica's smile. I tasted iron at the back of my tongue. I lifted my eyes to the bench. Morales met them, and in that narrow corridor between judge and witness, between past and present, the rumor took shape. I saw it happen the moment the legend he must have heard a dozen ways arranged itself into the woman in the plain navy dress, with the disciplined spine and the hands that wouldn't shake. The Queen of Law. I had never chosen the crown. Crowns are heavy, and they are lonely, and they are always, always borrowed. But I had worn the work. I had carried the weight. I had learned that justice is less a scale than a stubborn living thing that must be woken, fed, defended, and sometimes dragged inch by inch into the light. "Counsel appearances for the record," the judge said, bringing us back to the shore. Jennifer stated her name in firm, vowels polished to a shine. Her voice had the surface calm of water that hides a current. Across the aisle, Jessica angled her body toward the gallery, hungry for eyes. Cameras blinked like patient animals. I stood. The years pressed their cold hands into my lower back. The years did not win. When I spoke, I kept my tone level. The way you talk to a horse you mean to calm and ride. "Linda Villaseñor," I said. "For the plaintiff, Mr. Michael Villaseñor." The sound traveled like a bell struck once and perfectly. For a heartbeat, the courtroom held itself still, listening to the name decide where to belong in the past where it had slept, or in the present where it could do work. Somewhere behind me a coat sleeve rasped against a bench. Someone whispered, then swallowed the rest. On the defendant's table, Jennifer's pen hesitated, the smallest pause, the faintest tell. She recovered quickly, but not before I saw doubt lay a careful hand on her shoulder. Jessica laughed again, quick and brittle. "Your Honor," she said, pitching her voice toward outrage, "this is theatrics. She's his mother." "I am," I agreed, turning to look at my daughter-in-law the way a surgeon looks at a wound he intends to close. "And I am also licensed, sworn, and here." The judge's mouth did not move, but his eyes softened by a degree only a courtroom veteran would notice. "Very well," he said. "We'll proceed." The clerk resumed his scratch. Outside, somewhere beyond the concentric circles of glass and brick and permit-required parking, a church bell tolled noon and came late to us, softened by distance. I drew a breath that tasted faintly of lemon polish and old books and began, not with thunder but with stone, one fact, then another, and another set carefully, cleanly, where they could bear the weight to come. "The residence at issue," I said, opening the briefcase, sliding the first deed to the clerk, "was purchased in my client's name 2 years before the marriage. Title has never changed." A murmur rose and subsided. The judge glanced down, scanning the document with the habit of a man who has read his way out of more than one trap. On the far bench, Jessica's father pressed his lips together until they blanched. "We'll reach every claim, Your Honor," I continued, "including the question of custody. But before we discuss futures, we must honor origins. The law does not erase the past to make the present convenient." Across from me, Jessica's heels stopped tapping. For the first time since I had taken my seat, she looked uncomfortable in her dress. I felt Michael's fingers tighten around mine, the smallest pulse of hope, that frail, luminous thing. I did not let myself look at him. I kept my eyes forward, the way you do when you're carrying a candle through wind. Because I knew what was coming. I had heard it last night through a thin wooden door, each word a bruise on an 8-year-old's heart. I had the cold little drive tucked under the leather flap, patient as proof. And I knew that when it spoke, this room would change shape. For now, I placed the deed. For now, I let the clock tick. For now, I stood between my son and the abyss and felt the old fire rise again, not the blaze of anger, but the steadier, older heat of purpose. "Proceed," Judge Morales said. And I did. That morning, the sky above Chicago was the color of tin, the kind of sky that makes everything below it feel like a photograph printed in gray. The wind rolled in off the lake, sharp enough to cut through my wool coat. I remember thinking that it smelled faintly of rain, and exhaust an odd mix of endings and beginnings. Michael stood by the car, one hand on the crutch, the other holding the doorframe. The years had carved new lines into his face, but the look in his eyes, that quiet stubbornness that had once made him climb trees higher than any of the neighborhood boys, was still there. Only now it flickered, faint, under the weight of something I couldn't lift for him. "Mom, you don't have to come," he said. His voice was soft, the way people speak when they already know the answer. "If I don't, who will?" I replied, wrapping his scarf tighter around his neck. My fingers brushed the thin skin near his jaw, and for a second I felt how cold he was, how fragile he had become. He tried to smile and it almost worked. "You shouldn't have to see this." "I've seen worse," I said. I didn't add that I had lived worse too. When he started down the courthouse steps, each thud of his crutch echoed through the morning air. Tap, step, tap, step, a rhythm of endurance. People slowed as we passed. Some looked away politely, others stared. Pity has a sound, it rustles like paper and stings like acid. By the time we reached the entrance, the square in front of the courthouse was alive with whispers. Reporters lingered like carrion birds, waiting for their first headline of the day. A few neighbors from our old street stood in clusters, trading fragments of what they thought they knew. "It's the Villaseñor divorce," someone murmured. "They say it's ugly." Poor man. Their voices reached me through the wind, thin and cutting. I straightened my back and pretended not to hear. Then the black Mercedes slid into the curb beside us, tires hissing against wet pavement. The passenger door opened, and a flash of crimson fabric spilled out. Jessica stepped onto the sidewalk as though it were a red carpet laid just for her. Her dress clung to her like arrogance. Her sunglasses hid nothing. Behind her, her parents followed her mother's diamonds flashing, her father's hand on his cane like a declaration of superiority. Even her brother, the perpetual shadow, wore the smirk of someone who believed the verdict was already printed. When Jessica saw Michael, she tilted her head, studying him as though he were an unfamiliar stain on her perfect day. Then she smiled a small, victorious curve of her lips and turned away before he could look up. I felt something hard twist inside me. It wasn't jealousy or anger or even grief. It was older than all of those. It was the cold, mechanical realization that compassion had left her completely. "Keep walking," I whispered. Inside, the courthouse smelled of polish and old paper. The marble floor gleamed with the ghost of every foot that had come before. The air was thick with the mixed perfumes of strangers, cheap cologne, coffee, and nerves. Michael paused at the security checkpoint, fumbling with his crutch to empty his pockets. I placed my hand over his to steady him, and when the metal detector beeped softly at his leg brace, the guard's indifferent, "You're fine, sir," struck me like mercy disguised as bureaucracy. The hallway stretched long and hollow. Each door bore a number that felt like a countdown. We passed lawyers in suits too crisp for the weather, young interns clutching binders, janitors polishing the same tiles that would be dirty again by noon. The hum of fluorescent lights followed us like a quiet judgment. As we turned the corner toward Department 12, I saw the wooden double doors and, for a moment, the years peeled away. The smell of varnish and echoing voices pulled me backward to the days when I had walked these halls not as a visitor, but as a name people whispered with a mix of fear and respect. Linda Villaseñor, the woman who never lost a case she believed in. That was before the fall. Before I learned that even truth can drown when enough money fills the room. Michael noticed my hesitation. "Mom?" he asked. I forced a smile. Just catching my breath. The bailiff opened the doors. The sound inside hit me first, the low murmur of expectation, the shuffle of paper, the metallic scrape of chairs. Jessica was already there, seated beside Jennifer Rivers, her lawyer. Jennifer, the last time I had seen her, she was 26 and radiant with ideals. We used to share cheap takeout during midnight trial preps, talking about how we'd change the world with evidence and reason. But time, I've learned, turns even bright metal dull. When she looked up and saw me, a flash of recognition crossed her face, then vanished under the smooth professionalism of someone who has chosen her side. Jessica glanced back over her shoulder, met my eyes, and smirked. "You really came," she mouthed, as if attendance were a defeat. I met her look with silence. Nothing disarms cruelty faster than composure. I guided Michael to the plaintiff's table. His hand trembled as Saturday, I placed the old briefcase beside him and brushed a fleck of dust from its cover. "Mom," he whispered, voice cracking, "I can't do this." "Yes, you can," I said. "And you're not alone." The clerk called the case. The judge's chair creaked. And as I straightened my back, the familiar hum of the courtroom wrapped around me like an old, heavy coat. I knew this air. I knew this pressure. It was as if the years had folded back on themselves and handed me the same test, written in new ink. Outside, the rain began to fall thin, steady, insistent. Through the high windows, streaks of water traced down the glass like nervous tears. The trial of my son's life was about to begin. And this time, I wouldn't be just a spectator. There are moments that divide a life into before and after. For Michael, that moment arrived on a night painted in sirens and rain. I remember the phone call. It was nearly midnight, and I was sitting by the window with a cup of cold tea, waiting for him to come home from the construction site. The air was heavy with the smell of wet asphalt and thunder. When the phone rang, I almost didn't answer. I thought it was a wrong number, but something in my bones knew. "Mrs. Villaseñor," a trembling voice said. "It's about your son. There's been an accident at the site. You need to come now." My heart stopped. I didn't even put on shoes. I ran barefoot into the street, the wind clawing at my hair, my breath tearing in my throat. By the time I reached the hospital, my legs felt hollow. The corridor was an ocean of antiseptic light, the smell of bleach and fear. I saw the foreman pacing near the emergency ward, his helmet in his hands. When our eyes met, he looked down, ashamed. "He fell," he whispered. "There was an electric shock. He lost his balance. We tried." I didn't hear the rest. My body moved on its own toward the doors where nurses in scrubs whispered to each other. Through the small window of the recovery room I saw him, my son, my boy who used to run barefoot through the garden, chasing dragonflies. Now still, wrapped in white gauze, his leg elevated, his face pale as paper. Machines blinked and hummed beside him, counting every fragile breath. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. "Michael," I whispered. His eyelids fluttered, then opened halfway. "Mom?" His voice was barely a ghost. "I'm here," I said, taking his hand. It was cold and dry. "I'm right here." He tried to smile, but the morphine dulled even that. "Don't cry," he murmured. "I'm not," I lied. For 3 days and nights, I didn't leave his side. I learned the rhythm of those machines, the way each beep stitched another second of his life together. I prayed not to the God who had ignored me before, but to the silence that filled the hospital halls. When the doctor came on the 4th morning, he didn't need to say much. His eyes said everything. "Mrs. Villaseñor," he began gently, "your son will recover, but his legs there's permanent nerve damage. He'll need crutches for the rest of his life." The rest of his life. The words fell like stones into my chest. Michael was 29. Strong, proud, the kind of man who built homes with his hands. How do you tell someone like that they'll never stand the same again? I nodded, thanked the doctor, and when I was alone, I pressed my forehead to the cold hospital wall until it hurt enough to keep me from screaming. When Michael came home weeks later, the world had changed shape. His laughter, once easy now, came in small, measured breaths. The stairs became mountains. The silence between us, a canyon. Jessica, at first, was attentive. She brought soup in small bowls, adjusted his pillows, and smiled when I thanked her. I wanted to believe that she still loved him, that she still saw the man beneath the broken body. But love, I learned, can evaporate faster than mercy. By the 3rd month, her patience began to fray. She stayed out late, came home smelling of perfume that wasn't hers before. Her laughter changed a brittle, practiced sound that didn't belong in this house. I told myself she was tired, frightened, adjusting to a new life. But every morning, when I saw her eyes slide past Michael as if he were furniture, a chill crept through me. Then came the day that shattered the illusion. It was early, the sun barely rising. Michael sat by the window, crutched beside him, his face lit by that soft gray light. "Mom," he said, almost shy, "I'd like to go to the garden today. Just for a bit. Maybe Jessica could help me." I nodded, grateful for a glimpse of his old self. I walked into the kitchen where Jessica stood, immaculate as always, scrolling through her phone. "Jessica," I said gently, "Michael wants to go outside for some air. Could you help him?" She turned slowly, her expression flat. "I have things to do," she replied. "Just for a few minutes." Her voice rose, sharp as broken glass. "Can't he manage on his own? I'm not his nurse." The cup she was holding clattered into the sink. Coffee splashed across the counter like spilt blood. She grabbed her handbag and stormed out, the slam of the door echoing down the hallway. For a long moment, I couldn't move. Then I turned back to Michael's room. He was staring at the floor, pretending not to have heard. "It's fine, Mom," he whispered. "Forget it." But his voice broke on the last word. I pushed his wheelchair toward the garden. The air smelled of wet soil and old roses. I kept talking about nothing, how the oranges would soon ripen, how the neighbor's cat had kittens again, just to fill the silence. When I looked at him, he was staring at the horizon with eyes that didn't see. That night, I sat alone on the porch, the crickets loud in the darkness, and thought of how cruel life can be, how it takes the proudest man and breaks him quietly, not with thunder, but with small humiliations one day at a time. I swore, as the wind stirred the leaves above me, that I would not let anyone take what little dignity he had left. Not Jessica, not the law, not even fate. Because a mother's fight, once awakened, is a storm no one can silence. At first, Jessica's transformation happened so slowly that even I wanted to believe it was my imagination. Grief and exhaustion make you see ghosts where there are none, but this time, the ghost was alive, wearing lipstick, and sitting across from me at breakfast. The mornings had become a fragile routine. I would make coffee, Michael would take his medication, and Jessica would come down the stairs never at the same hour twice, always dressed like she had somewhere better to be. The smell of expensive perfume filled the room before she even spoke. When she did speak, her words had lost their warmth. "Good morning," she would say flatly without looking at either of us. Then, one morning, she didn't say it at all. I remember that day clearly. The sunlight came through the window in thin, reluctant lines. Michael sat at the table, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he didn't drink. Jessica breezed in, phone in hand, wearing a tight black dress that didn't belong in a kitchen. She didn't glance at Michael, just picked up a single slice of toast, took one bite, and turned to leave. "Jessica," I called softly, "aren't you going to eat with us?" She froze at the door, sighed, and said, "I'm not hungry." There was no anger in her voice, no sadness either, just indifference, the kind that kills slower than cruelty but cuts deeper. Michael said nothing. His gaze followed her until the door clicked shut. Then he stared down at his plate, pushing the food around as if it were an unsolvable problem. That night, she didn't come home. It started with excuses. Dinner with friends, a meeting that ran late, just needed to clear my head. But when her perfume began to change every week and strange cologne lingered on her coat, I knew the truth she was hiding behind that flawless mask. One evening I was walking past the kitchen when I heard her voice through the half-open door. She was on the phone, whispering fast, urgent. "Don't worry," she said, her tone sharp and businesslike. "Once the house is sold, we'll have more than enough to start over." My chest tightened. The house Michael had built with his own hands, the one he had promised would be ours forever. Now, it was currency in her private negotiation. I wanted to burst in, to confront her. But I stopped myself. I needed proof. Anger without evidence is just noise. When I turned to go, my reflection in the glass cabinet caught my eye. I saw the lines around my mouth, the exhaustion under my eyes, the ghost of the woman I had once been. Once, I had stood in courtrooms and bent arrogance into confession. Now I was sneaking through my own kitchen like a thief, collecting scraps of betrayal. The next week, her mask slipped completely. It was raining, the sky dark by late afternoon. Michael's pain was worse that day. I was in his room when he called out weakly, "Jessica, could you help me with my brace?" She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, the faintest smirk on her lips. "I'm not your nurse, Michael," she said. "You can hire someone if you need help." She turned and walked away, her heels echoing down the hallway like a metronome, counting the seconds of a dying marriage. I froze. The air around me felt too thick to breathe. Michael's hand trembled as he reached for the crutch, trying to fasten the strap himself. I moved quickly to help, but he stopped me halfway. "It's fine," he said, his voice breaking. "If she doesn't want to, don't force her." The shame in his eyes was worse than any wound. After that night, silence moved into our house and refused to leave. It settled on the walls, on the floorboards, in the spaces between our sentences. Jessica spoke only when necessary. Michael spoke only when he couldn't avoid it. And I learned that anger can be a quiet thing too. The neighbors began to notice. At the market, Mrs. Davis, who never kept a secret for long, leaned over the counter and whispered, "Linda, I don't want to talk out of turn, but I've seen your daughter-in-law around town with a man. Not your son." I smiled faintly, thanked her, and walked away. but the words clung to me like smoke. That evening I stayed up late, staring out the window at the rain-streaked glass, wondering how much longer I could pretend not to see what was right in front of me. In the morning, Jessica came into the kitchen wearing a dress that shimmered like a lie. She poured herself a cup of coffee, humming a tune I didn't recognize. When she turned to leave, she paused at the doorway. "Michael should really consider selling this place," she said casually. "It's too big for us now. Too gloomy." I didn't look up from my plate. "The house isn't for sale," I said. She shrugged. "Everything is, for the right price." Then she smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and walked out. When the door closed behind her, I let my fork fall onto the table. The sound was sharp, final. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't just neglect or fatigue. This was strategy. Jessica was preparing to leave, but not before she took everything with her. And I, once the queen of law, would have to become her reckoning. There are moments when betrayal stops being an idea and becomes sound. An actual sound that breaks the air and rearranges everything you thought you knew. For me, that sound was Jessica's voice behind a half-closed door. It was late, nearly midnight. The house was quiet except for the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the occasional groan of the old pipes. I had been awake for hours, unable to sleep, haunted by Michael's pained breathing echoing through the walls. I decided to go downstairs for water. That's when I heard it, her voice, low but urgent, coming from the kitchen. I froze halfway down the staircase, the wooden rail cool beneath my palm. "You don't have to worry," Jessica whispered. Her tone was sharp, quick, almost gleeful. "Once the house is sold, we'll get what we planned. He doesn't even suspect. He's too broken to fight back." There was silence. Then a man's voice, deep and smooth, came through, faintly too muffled to make out the words, but intimate enough to twist my stomach. She laughed, a quiet, honeyed sound that I had once mistaken for kindness. I pressed my back against the wall, heart pounding so hard it drowned the ticking clock. Every word she said was a dagger turned slow. "Don't worry about his mother," she continued, her voice lowering to a hiss. "She's just an old woman living off pity. Soon she'll have nothing." My breath caught. For a second I felt dizzy, as though the house itself tilted beneath me. I wanted to burst in, to tear that phone from her hand and make her look me in the eye, but I didn't. Instead, I stood there in the half-dark, gripping the banister until my knuckles whitened, forcing myself to remember who I was. A courtroom doesn't belong to the one who shouts the loudest. It belongs to the one who waits for silence and strikes with proof. When she hung up, I slipped quietly back to my room. I sat at the edge of the bed, hands trembling, and looked at the old leather briefcase that leaned against the dresser. Its locks were rusted, its corners worn, but it still held the weight of my former life, the years I had spent building a reputation that could make liars choke on their own stories. I hadn't opened it in over a decade. That night, I did. Inside were old documents, yellowed transcripts, the smell of ink and sleepless nights. Beneath them lay a small notepad, half filled with handwriting that once shaped destinies. I ran my fingers over it, the way a pianist touches keys after years of silence. If Jessica wanted a war, she would get one, but not on her terms. The next morning, I made breakfast as usual: scrambled eggs, toast, a bowl of fruit. My hands were steady now. Michael shuffled into the kitchen, leaning on his crutch, his face pale but composed. "Morning, Mom," he said quietly. "Morning, son." Jessica joined us minutes later, her hair flawless, her smile rehearsed. She looked at Michael with that same detached politeness she reserved for strangers. "Busy day ahead?" I asked her casually, sliding the plate toward her. She shrugged. "Meetings, errands, you know how it is." I smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. "Of course, I know exactly how it is." She blinked as if trying to read whether I meant something more. Then she laughed lightly and returned to her phone. That day, I started my own quiet investigation. I went through the mail that arrived at the house: bills, bank statements, insurance notices. Most were addressed to Michael, but one envelope, glossy and unfamiliar, was for Jessica. It bore the logo of a luxury property agency. The return address was downtown Gold Coast. I slipped it open with surgical precision. Inside were printed listings of apartments overlooking Lake Michigan. Each page bore the same handwritten note at the bottom: "Call William." William. The name from the night before. My suspicions hardened into certainty. That evening, I called an old contact, Robert Medina. Once upon a time, we had shared victories in the courtroom. Now he worked in shadows as a private investigator. "Linda," he said when he picked up, his voice gravelly with surprise. "I thought you were done with all this." "I was," I answered, "but someone just mistook my silence for weakness." He chuckled softly. "That was their mistake. What do you need?" "Information," I said, "about a woman named Jessica Torres and a man called William." He hesitated. "You want me to dig into your daughter-in-law?" "Yes," I said without a tremor. "Discretion, Robert. I need the truth, and I need it clean." "Consider it done." When I hung up, I looked through the window into the backyard. The orange tree swayed gently in the night breeze, its branches heavy with fruit. Michael had planted it the day he finished building the house. "Something that lasts," he'd said proudly. Now, that very house, the heart of everything we'd built, was what Jessica meant to carve apart. As I stood there in the dark, the rain started again, whispering against the windows. I closed my eyes and felt the fire return, slow and deliberate. This wasn't only about saving a home. It was about reminding the world and myself that the Queen of Law hadn't died. She had only been resting. And when she wakes, justice follows. The house had always been Michael's pride, a monument to years of struggle and sacrifice. Every brick, every nail, every coat of paint carried the echo of his laughter, the memory of his hands working late into the night. I still remember the day he gave me the keys, his face shining with sweat and joy. "Mom," he'd said, "this is our home. No one will ever take it from us." Now, as I walked through those same rooms, I could feel the promise fading like old wallpaper. The air inside had grown heavy. It wasn't neglect, it was sorrow. You could hear it in the soft squeak of Michael's crutches, in the sound of a chair scraping across the floor, in the silence that followed every meal. Even the walls seemed to have learned how to keep quiet. Michael spent most of his days in the downstairs room I had converted for him. It was once meant to be a playroom for the children he and Jessica dreamed of having. Now it held a narrow bed, a small desk, and a chair that leaned slightly to one side, as if sharing his fatigue. I often caught him staring at the window, the curtain half drawn, watching the garden he could no longer tend. His hands, once calloused and strong, now trembled when he lifted a cup of tea. Still, he tried to hide it, forcing a smile each time I entered. "Don't worry, Mom," he would say. "I'm okay." But he wasn't. I could see it in the way he spoke less and less each day, in the haunted quiet that clung to him like a second skin. Jessica, on the other hand, seemed to grow louder as the house grew quieter. Her laughter, artificial and sharp, filled the rooms when she spoke on the phone. I'd hear her voice from behind closed doors, always teasing, always sweet, but never for Michael. Sometimes she'd bring home shopping bags from stores that used to intimidate me, dresses in silk, shoes that cost more than a month's groceries. I would watch her unpack them on the living room sofa, her hands moving with deliberate grace. "Jessica," I asked one afternoon, "are you sure we can afford all this?" She didn't even look up. "I can," she said flatly. "You and Michael don't have to worry." Her tone left no room for reply. She picked up a bottle of perfume and sprayed it lightly into the air. The scent, something floral and expensive, lingered long after she had left the room. That night, Michael called her name from his room. His voice was faint, the way a candle flickers before it goes out. "Jessica, can you help me?" She appeared in the doorway, irritation etched into her face. "What now?" "My leg hurts," he said quietly. "Can you just massage it for a bit?" She sighed, looked at her nails, and then snapped, "I told you, I'm not your nurse. Hire someone if you need care." The words hit like stones. I was standing in the hallway, invisible, listening. The cup in my hand shook until I nearly dropped it. "Jessica, please," Michael murmured, but she was already walking away. The silence that followed felt louder than a scream. When I stepped into his room moments later, he was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at his hands. His eyes were red, though he tried to smile when he saw me. "It's nothing, Mom," he said hoarsely. "Don't worry." But I did. Every day. He began skipping meals. His clothes hung looser. Some mornings he didn't get out of bed until noon. I tried to coax him back to life with stories, with old family photos, even with jokes. But his laughter when it came was soft, uncertain, like someone remembering how to breathe. One evening, as I folded laundry, I heard Jessica humming upstairs. The tune was unfamiliar, something light and romantic. Then came the faint sound of her voice. "I can't wait to be done with this place." I froze. Through the thin ceiling, her words drifted down like ashes. That was the night I decided I couldn't wait any longer for Robert's report. I needed to act. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table with Michael's old property deed spread before me. I read every line twice, every clause 3 times. My legal instincts, buried but never dead, began to stir. The deed was clean, purchased 2 years before his marriage. His name alone was on it. She had no claim, none, unless she could twist the law into believing the house was marital property. And knowing Jessica and whoever this William was, I knew that was exactly what they planned to do. That evening when Jessica returned home, she found me waiting in the living room. I had lit no lamps. Only the gray light of dusk filtered through the curtains. "Jessica," I said calmly, "we need to talk about the house." She stopped at the threshold, clutching her handbag. "What about it?" "You've been making inquiries downtown," I continued. "Luxury apartments, agents calling. You might have forgotten the mail comes to this address." For a split second, I saw the truth flash across her face. Then she smiled, that rehearsed, brittle smile. "You must be mistaken," she said lightly. "I was just browsing. You know, for fun." "Of course," I replied. "Browsing. I suppose betrayal starts the same way." Her eyes hardened. "Careful, Mother," she hissed. "You're crossing a line." "I've lived my life on lines," I said, standing, "but I've never crossed one I couldn't defend." She turned sharply and left without another word. Her heels struck the floor like punctuation marks to an argument I had already won in silence. After she was gone, I sat down and let the quiet fill the room again. Outside, the orange tree swayed in the wind, its branches brushing against the window like a hand asking to be let in. I realized then that this house wasn't just bricks and beams. It was the battlefield where love had turned to ambition, where promises had curdled into deceit. It was the house that tears built. And before anyone tore it apart, I would make sure every lie spoken inside these walls was dragged into the light. It was late afternoon when the doorbell rang, a sharp, deliberate sound that cut through the stillness of the house. The sky outside was iron gray, the kind that pressed down like a lid. I had been in the kitchen, scrubbing a pan that didn't need scrubbing, just to quiet my thoughts. Michael was in his room, napping. When the bell rang again, longer this time, something inside me knew it wasn't a neighbor or delivery. I wiped my hands, steadied my breath, and opened the door. Jessica stood there, dressed as though she were walking into a board meeting, not her husband's home. A fitted blue dress, pearl earrings, that expensive perfume that lingered too long in the air. But what froze me wasn't her, it was who stood beside her. Jennifer Rivers. Her posture hadn't changed, straight spine, calm eyes, confidence measured in breaths. But the woman I saw now wasn't the Jennifer I used to know. Her smile was gone, replaced by the polite detachment of someone who charged by the hour and never lost sleep over it. She held a slim leather briefcase under her arm and nodded once, almost courteously. "Linda," she said, her voice even, "it's been a long time." I took a moment before answering. Not long enough, apparently. Jessica stepped forward, her heels clacking against the floor like a countdown. "We're not here to argue," she said briskly. "We're here to settle things properly." She dropped a stack of documents onto the table beside the doorway. "It's a divorce petition. You can tell Michael he doesn't need to drag this out. Half the house will be mine, and the court will see to it." I stared at the papers. For a heartbeat, I thought I could hear them breathing the sound of ink and arrogance. "Half the house?" I repeated quietly. "Yes," she replied, crossing her arms. "We're legally married, which makes all assets shared property. That's the law, isn't it?" Jennifer's eyes flickered toward me, measuring. She didn't speak yet, but I could see the argument forming behind her calm expression. I let out a slow breath. "You're right, Jessica," I said. "It is the law. But you've misread it, like you misread people." Her smile faltered. "This house," I continued, "was purchased 2 years before your marriage. It's in Michael's name alone. It's not community property, it's separate property. You can't touch it." Jennifer shifted her stance slightly, the faintest movement of someone regaining control. There are precedents, she said coolly. In long-term cohabitations, even separate property can be reclassified as marital, especially when used as a family home. Her tone was smooth, practiced, but her eyes betrayed her. She was trying to provoke me, to make me argue law on impulse, to corner me into speaking before I was ready. I had seen that tactic 1,000 times. I smiled instead. You're quoting state case law from memory, Jennifer. I taught you that trick. A flicker crossed her face, embarrassment. Irritation, maybe both. Jessica frowned, confused by the sudden shift in tone. What are you talking about? I turned to her. Your lawyer here used to be my intern, many years ago, before she decided to trade truth for convenience. Linda, Jennifer warned softly, but there was no conviction in her voice. Jessica's eyes widened. Wait, you're saying you were a lawyer? Was, I corrected. And still am, when necessary. For the first time, the silence between us felt fragile, dangerous. Even the ticking clock on the wall seemed to hesitate. Jessica, I said gently, almost kindly, you should leave while you still can. Her cheeks flushed crimson. You don't scare me, she spat. You think a few old connections will change anything? The court will see Michael for what he is. A cripple who can't work, can't provide, and you, she sneered, you're just a bitter old woman trying to live through your son. I stepped forward, close enough to see the pulse in her neck. Be very careful, Jessica. You're not the first person who's underestimated me in a courtroom. The others learned too late. She opened her mouth to reply, but Jennifer laid a hand on her arm. Jessica, she murmured, let's go. We've delivered the papers. There's nothing more to say. Jessica hesitated, glaring at me one last time, then turned sharply on her heel and stormed out. Jennifer lingered a moment longer. Her eyes softened, just barely. You shouldn't have come back, she said quietly. Neither should you, I replied. Then she was gone. The front door closed with a slow, final click. The house seemed to exhale. I stood there for a long while, staring at the stack of papers on the table. The words, "Petition for Dissolution of Marriage," glared up at me in black ink. My name appeared several times. Respondent's mother present at address, potential witness, financial caretaker. I turned the first page. Every line dripped with calculation, claims of neglect, of emotional instability, even a section implying that I had undue influence over my son. They were painting me as the manipulative mother who couldn't let go. I laughed quietly. It wasn't humor, it was disbelief. The kind of laugh that escapes when you realize someone has mistaken your restraint for ignorance. When Michael woke later, I brought the papers to him. He read in silence, his face pale. She really means it, he whispered. She's taking everything. I placed my hand over his. No, Michael, I said softly. She's taking her last chance. He looked at me, eyes trembling with both fear and hope. Mom, what are you going to do? I closed the folder, slid it back into my old leather briefcase, and fastened the clasp. What I've always done, I said, fight with the truth. That night, long after Michael had fallen asleep, I sat alone in the living room. The sound of the rain against the window blended with the hum of the city outside. I could feel the pulse of something returning, a part of me I thought I'd buried with my past. The Queen of Law was stirring again, not out of pride but out of duty. Because justice, once denied, has a way of finding its voice again, especially when spoken by a mother. That night, the house was so quiet, I could hear the refrigerator hum and the rain tapping gently on the kitchen window. Michael had gone to bed early. Exhaustion clung to him like a second skin. I sat in the dark living room, the divorce petition lying open on my lap, every word pulsing like a bruise. I should have been numb by now. After all, betrayal wasn't new to me. It had taken my husband years ago, stolen my sleep, and hardened the soft parts of me. But watching it happen to Michael, watching Jessica weave lies around him like a silken noose, that was a different kind of torture. I was still awake when I heard it. Faint voices coming from the guest bedroom at the end of the hall. Jessica's voice and someone else's, small and fragile. Sarah. I set the papers down and stood slowly, careful not to make the floorboards creak. As I drew closer, the words became clearer, sliding through the narrow crack under the door. Listen carefully, Sarah, Jessica whispered. Tomorrow in court, when the judge asks you who you want to live with, you must say you don't want to stay with Daddy anymore. My blood ran cold. Sarah's tiny voice trembled. But I love Daddy. I don't want to say that. Jessica's reply was sharp, metallic. Do you want to live poor? Do you want to sleep in that tiny room with your grandmother forever? William and I can give you a real-life trips, toys, a big house, but only if you do what I say. William again. The name had become a curse I hadn't yet spoken aloud. I pressed my hand to my mouth to keep from gasping. There was a pause, then Sarah's voice again, muffled by tears. It's not true, Mommy. Daddy takes care of me. He loves me. Jessica exhaled loudly, impatience simmering through every breath. Sarah, if you don't obey, you'll never see me again. Do you understand? You'll lose me. I gripped the doorknob until my knuckles went white. Every instinct screamed at me to rush in, to pull that child into my arms and tear Jessica's words out of the air before they reached her ears, but I didn't. I stood frozen, listening, letting the poison reveal itself. When Jessica's voice softened again, it was worse. Don't cry, sweetheart. You'll be helping us. Daddy will be fine. He has your grandmother. The tears came silently, hot and blinding. Not for me, not even for Michael, but for the little girl whose mother was teaching her to lie. When I finally stepped back, the house seemed to shift around me, as if every wall had heard what I had just witnessed. I went to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, trembling. My reflection in the mirror stared back, pale and unfamiliar. I hadn't seen that face, the one full of fury and purpose, since the days I stood in front of juries and tore deceit apart word by word. I thought of Sarah's small voice, of Michael's tired eyes, of the hollow sound in Jessica's laughter, and in that moment, I knew I couldn't wait for the court to uncover the truth. I had to bring it there myself. The next morning, I found Sarah sitting in the backyard under the orange tree. The air smelled faintly of dew and citrus. She was wearing a faded blue dress, her knees pulled up to her chest, her eyes red from crying. I sat beside her on the old wooden bench. "Sarah," I said softly, "your grandma needs to talk to you about something important." She looked up, startled, her lips trembling. "Grandma, I didn't mean to do anything wrong." My heart broke a little more. "I know you didn't," I said, taking her tiny hands in mine. "But last night, I heard what your mommy told you." Her eyes widened in horror. "Please don't tell her I told." I shook my head gently. "You don't have to worry, my love. You didn't tell anyone. I just heard." Tears welled up in her eyes again. "Grandma, I don't want to lie. I want to stay here with Daddy and you. But Mommy said if I don't say what she wants, she'll leave forever." I swallowed hard, fighting the lump in my throat. "Sometimes people say things when they're scared, Sarah. But the truth, your truth, is the most powerful thing you have. Do you understand?" She nodded weakly. "Even if it makes Mommy mad?" "Yes," I whispered. "Even then. Especially then." She looked at me for a long moment, her lower lip trembling. "Grandma," she said finally, "will you be there tomorrow, when I talk to the judge?" "I'll be right beside you," I said, and I meant it. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I heard the door slam upstairs, Jessica leaving again, no doubt to meet William. I sat at my desk, opened the drawer, and pulled out the small black recording device Robert had once given me back when I worked in law. "For when truth hides behind closed doors," he had said. I turned it over in my hand, the faint weight of it like a promise. Then I went to Sarah's room, pressed the device gently under her bed frame, and whispered, "Forgive me, my angel, but sometimes even love needs proof." Later that night, when Jessica came home, her laughter floated through the hall again, bright, cruel, unshaken. But this time, the walls were listening. The whispers she had planted would become her undoing. And by tomorrow, I would have the weapon I needed, her own words. The following morning dawned gray and reluctant, as if the sun itself doubted whether it should rise on this family. The storm had passed during the night, but the smell of wet earth clung to the air. I had hardly slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Jessica's voice whispering lies to Sarah, as clear as if she were still at that door. I rose before anyone else, dressed quietly, and retrieved the small recorder from beneath Sarah's bed. It was still warm from running all night. I held it in my hand like something sacred and poisonous, at once the truth, trapped in a little black box. Michael was still asleep when I left. I didn't wake him. Some truths must be prepared carefully, and he had suffered enough shocks to last a lifetime. Outside, the streets were slick. the sky heavy. I walked with purpose toward a narrow alley on the south side of the city where a man named Robert Medina kept an office that time had forgotten. Robert had been my partner in a dozen battles long ago. He wasn't a lawyer. He was something rarer, a finder of what others wanted buried. We had met in the fire of corruption cases, where the powerful bought silence and the brave paid in scars. Back then, they called me the Queen of Law, but if I was the queen, Robert was my sword. The bell above his office door jangled as I entered. The room smelled of old tobacco, dust, and secrets. He was there behind his desk, his hair now more gray than black, a cigarette balanced between his fingers. When he looked up and saw me, his eyes widened. "Linda," he said slowly, as though saying a name from a dream. "Well, I'll be damned. I thought you'd left the battlefield for good." "Apparently the war followed me home," I replied, placing the recorder on his desk. He studied me for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair, the old wood creaking in protest. "Who's the enemy?" "Jessica Torres," I said. "My daughter-in-law. She's trying to destroy my son, and she's not alone." Robert's eyes narrowed. "You have proof?" "Not yet, but I will." I pushed the recorder toward him. "This is a start." He pressed play. Jessica's voice spilled into the room, smooth and cruel. "Tomorrow in court you'll say you don't want to live with Daddy anymore. Do you understand?" Then Sarah's soft, trembling sob, "But I love Daddy." Robert stopped the tape halfway through, his jaw tightening. "Jesus, Linda. Tell me you can clean up the audio," I said. "Make it admissible." He nodded slowly. "It's enough. But if she's this reckless, there's more out there. People like her always leave trails, hotel bills, messages, bank transfers. You know the pattern." "I do," I said quietly. He stubbed out his cigarette and reached for a notepad. "Tell me everything from the beginning." And I did. From Michael's accident to the divorce petition, to the mysterious William whose shadow loomed over every lie. He took notes with the precision of a surgeon, asking only the questions that mattered. When I finished, he leaned forward. "I'll find him," he said. "But you know what this means, don't you?" "I do. It'll stir things up. People with money and pride don't like being exposed." "I don't care," I said simply. "This isn't about money. It's about my son and a little girl who deserves to grow up knowing what truth sounds like." He smiled faintly, the corner of his mouth twitching upward. "You haven't changed, Queen." "Don't call me that," I murmured. "Queen's rule. I only survive." He chuckled, but it faded quickly. "Give me 3 days. Maybe 4. I'll contact you when I have something." When I left his office, the air outside felt colder, sharper. The city stretched before me, gray streets, people rushing nowhere, the constant hum of distant traffic. I walked slowly back to the car, feeling the recorder's weight in my pocket. Proof. It was small, but it was the first stone in the wall I would build around Michael and Sarah. By the time I got home, the house was stirring. Michael was sitting at the table, a cup of untouched coffee in front of him. Jessica stood near the window, already dressed to leave, tapping something on her phone. When she noticed me, her lips curled into a smile that never reached her eyes. "You're up early, Mother." "Late night prayers?" "Something like that," I said, setting my bag down. "I hope you're praying for strength," she said lightly. "You'll need it after tomorrow." I met her gaze without blinking. "And you'll need forgiveness." Her eyebrows arched in mock surprise. "For what?" "For underestimating the wrong woman." She laughed a sound so hollow it didn't even echo. "Oh, Linda, you really should let go of your old fantasies of control. You're not in a courtroom anymore." "Maybe not," I said. "But I still know how to win one." She hesitated, then turned toward the door. "I have errands to run," she muttered. "Try not to tire yourself out worrying about things that aren't your business." When she left, the silence she left behind felt almost merciful. Michael looked at me from across the table, his voice barely a whisper. "Mom, what are you planning?" I sat down opposite him, folded my hands, and said the only thing I could. Justice. 3 nights later, Robert called. "Meet me at the cafe on Wabash," he said. "I've got something you'll want to see." When I arrived, he was already there in a corner booth, a cup of black coffee steaming in front of him. He slid a manila folder across the table. "You were right," he said. "William Harris, real estate developer. Married once, divorced twice, very discreet about both. Known for charming women out of their homes and their savings. He's got your daughter-in-law wrapped around his finger." I opened the folder. The photographs were crisp and merciless Jessica in a red dress, laughing, her hand in William's as they exited a hotel I recognized from downtown. In another, he was holding the car door open for her, her head thrown back in laughter. My throat went dry. "How long?" "Months. Maybe a year," Robert said. "He pays her credit cards, covers her shopping, even wired her $10,000 last month." I traced the transfer. I closed the folder, my hands steady though I felt my pulse drumming in my ears. "This is enough," I said. "Enough for what?" "For truth," I replied. "For tomorrow." He leaned back, studying me. "You're going to take this to court yourself, aren't you?" "Yes." "Linda," he said almost gently, "you know what that means. Once you step in, there's no going back. You'll have to reveal everything your past, your name, the whole story." I met his eyes. "Then let them remember who I was." He smiled faintly, with that old mixture of admiration and worry. "You always did like dramatic entrances." "Not this time," I said, sliding the folder into my briefcase. "This time, it's not about the entrance, it's about the ending." That night, I returned home under a moonless sky. The house stood still, dark and waiting. Michael was asleep, his crutches leaning by the bed like sentinels. I looked at him for a long moment, remembering the boy who once said, "Mom, no one will ever kick us out again." I walked to my room, opened the briefcase, and placed Robert's folder beside the recorder. The truth was ready, the weapons were aligned. Tomorrow, I would walk into the courtroom not as a spectator, not as a mother begging for mercy, but as who I had been all along. A woman who had lost everything once and learned how to win it back with evidence, conviction, and fire. The Queen of Law was returning to the battlefield. The morning of the trial arrived heavy with drizzle and dread. The rain hadn't stopped all night, and by dawn it had turned to a fine mist that blurred the city skyline into shades of silver and ash. From the window, I could see the wet leaves pressed against the glass like fingerprints from another life. Michael sat at the kitchen table, silent, tracing the rim of his coffee cup with one finger. His suit hung a little too loose on him. He had lost weight these past weeks. His eyes, those gentle brown eyes that once carried laughter, were dim, hollowed out by exhaustion. "Mom," he said quietly, "you don't have to come today." I buttoned my coat. "If I didn't come, it wouldn't be a trial," I replied. He tried to smile, but it faltered. "I'm scared," he admitted. "Not of losing, just of seeing her." I rested my hand on his shoulder. "Then don't look at her," I said. "Look at me." When we stepped outside, the rain was soft but relentless. I helped him into the car, folded his crutch beside him, and watched his breath fog the window. Every mile we drove toward the courthouse, the memories from my old life pressed closer: the smell of polished oak, the echo of gavels, the faces of men who thought they could rewrite truth with enough signatures. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed that sound, the measured pulse of justice waiting to be claimed. The courthouse loomed ahead, tall and indifferent, its stone columns gleaming wet. A small crowd had gathered under umbrellas: reporters, curious onlookers, a few neighbors. As I helped Michael out of the car, someone whispered, "That's him, the husband in the Villaseñor divorce." The words followed us like the mist, thin, cold, impossible to shake. Inside, the fluorescent lights were too bright, the air heavy with tension. Jessica was already there, seated at the defendant's table beside Jennifer Rivers. She wore an emerald dress that shimmered under the lights, her posture perfect, her smile deliberate. Behind her sat her parents, their expressions stiff with pride. When she saw Michael, she tilted her head slightly and whispered something to Jennifer. The two women laughed softly. My stomach clenched. We took our seats. Michael adjusted his crutch awkwardly beneath the table, his hands trembling. I reached across and gave his fingers a squeeze. "You don't need to speak today," I whispered. "I will." The bailiff called for order, and the murmuring in the room faded. "All rise," he said, as Judge Stephen Morales entered. The moment he stepped onto the bench, the years seemed to collapse around us. The courtroom that had once been a stranger's arena was suddenly familiar ground. His eyes swept across the room, first to Jennifer, then to Jessica, and finally to me. Recognition flared there, but he masked it quickly with professionalism. "Be seated," he said, his voice steady but softer than I remembered. Jennifer rose first, perfectly rehearsed. "Your Honor," she began, "my client, Mrs. Jessica Torres, seeks a fair and lawful dissolution of marriage. We intend to show that her husband, Mr. Michael Villaseñor, due to his medical condition, is unable to fulfill his duties as both a husband and a father. We will also establish that the marital home, though purchased before the union, became shared property during the years they lived together." Her tone was crisp, confident, the voice of someone who believed preparation was enough to win a war. When she finished, the judge nodded. "Thank you, Miss Rivers." He looked to our side. "Mrs. Villaseñor, are you representing your son?" I rose slowly. "Yes, Your Honor." For a moment, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The name Villaseñor had carried a certain weight once, and I could feel it ripple through the room like the first tremor of a storm. "Proceed," he said. I walked to the center of the courtroom, the old leather briefcase in my hand. Its worn handle fit perfectly against my palm, as if it had been waiting for this day as much as I had. "Your Honor," I began, my voice clear but low, "before we discuss claims, we must remember facts. This house," I gestured toward the documents I placed on the table, "was purchased 2 years before my son's marriage. The deed, title, and financing records all bear his name alone. That makes it separate property under state law. No matter how long it has served as a residence, its ownership cannot be rewritten by greed or convenience." The clerk collected the documents and handed them to the judge. He scanned them briefly, expression unreadable. Jennifer rose, her pen already in motion. "Your Honor," she interjected, "as case law shows—" I didn't let her finish. "Case law also shows," I said evenly, "that marital use does not automatically confer marital ownership. You know that, Miss Rivers. You learned it in my office." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Jennifer froze for a fraction of a second, long enough for the truth to show. Jessica frowned, looking from her lawyer to me. "Your office?" she said aloud, incredulous. Jennifer shot her a glare, but it was too late. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Miss Rivers, is that accurate?" Jennifer hesitated, then forced a polite smile. "I had the privilege of working with Mrs. Villaseñor many years ago, Your Honor." "So you're aware of her qualifications?" he asked. "Yes, Your Honor." The gallery stirred again. I saw flashes from phones reporters capturing what they sensed would become a story. The Queen of Law returns. Jessica's composure cracked. Her lips pressed into a thin, furious line. I turned to her, my tone calm but sharp enough to draw blood. "You should know, Jessica, the law doesn't bend for those who treat it like a weapon. It's not your toy. It's the record of everything you tried to hide." She leaned forward, hissing through clenched teeth. "You think you can scare me? You're just an old woman living in my husband's pity." I smiled faintly. "Then you should have checked my name before you stepped into my courtroom." Judge Morales banged his gavel lightly. "Mrs. Villaseñor, please direct your remarks through the bench." "Of course, Your Honor," I said smoothly. He tried to hide the ghost of a smile. From behind me, I felt Michael's trembling hand resting on my shoulder. He didn't speak, but the pressure of his fingers said what words couldn't. "Thank you." The rest of the morning unfolded in procedural motions, financial disclosures, witness statements, and the tedious rhythm of bureaucracy. But beneath it all, I could feel the current shifting. The tide was turning. When the judge finally called for recess, Jessica stood abruptly, gathering her things. "This isn't over," she muttered as she brushed past me. "No," I said softly. "It's just beginning." She didn't look back. I stood there for a moment, the courtroom emptying around me, the sound of rain muffled against the windows. My reflection shimmered faintly in the polished wood of the judge's bench. I barely recognized her, the woman staring back at me. She looked older, yes, but also alive in a way she hadn't been in years. Justice has a strange way of reviving the dead parts of us. Tomorrow I would bring the evidence, the recording, the photos, the truth. Tomorrow the lies would burn. But tonight I let myself breathe. Just once. Because I knew that once I stepped into that courtroom again, there would be no turning back. The next day, the courtroom was full before the session even began. Word had spread overnight the Queen of Law was back. Reporters lined the back row, their pens poised, their cameras blinking like restless eyes. Even the court clerks whispered to each other as I walked in beside Michael, the steady tap of his crutch marking our entrance like the beat of a drum. Jessica sat at the defendant's table, dressed impeccably as always, but there was a strain around her eyes now. The emerald green dress from yesterday had been replaced by navy blue, more somber, more cautious. Beside her, Jennifer shuffled papers with hands that moved a little too quickly. The judge entered. The murmurs died instantly. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. "Proceed," Judge Morales said, nodding in my direction. I stood slowly, the old leather briefcase in my hand. It creaked as I set it on the table, the sound strangely ceremonial. I opened it with deliberate care and withdrew a manila envelope. "Your Honor," I began, my voice calm but ringing clear across the room. "Yesterday, we presented property documents proving that the home in question was acquired by my son, Mr. Michael Villaseñor, before his marriage to Mrs. Jessica Torres. Today we present evidence regarding the conduct and intent of Mrs. Torres, evidence that goes to the heart of this divorce." Jennifer stood. "Objection, Your Honor. We were not provided any such evidence in pre-trial disclosure." I turned to her. "You'll understand why once you hear it." The judge looked between us. "Mrs. Villaseñor, you're aware of the procedural rules." "Yes, Your Honor," I said evenly. "But this is evidence of perjury and attempted coercion of a minor witness. It came into my possession only 2 nights ago." That got his attention. The courtroom erupted in a low wave of whispers. The judge raised a hand for silence. "Proceed." I nodded and held up the small black recorder. "Your Honor, this device contains a conversation recorded in the home of the Villaseñor family. The voices are of Mrs. Jessica Torres and her 8-year-old daughter, Sarah. In it, Mrs. Torres instructs the child to lie in this very courtroom to say she no longer wishes to live with her father." Jennifer's composure cracked for the first time. "That's outrageous," she said, turning to Jessica. Jessica grabbed her arm. "Don't you dare let them play that." But the judge had already gestured to the clerk. "Let's hear it," he said. The clerk took the recorder, pressed play, and the room fell silent except for the faint static. Then came Jessica's voice, sharp and unmistakable. "Tomorrow in court, when the judge asks, you'll say you don't want to live with Daddy anymore. Say he can't take care of you. Do you understand?" Then Sarah's trembling reply. "But I love Daddy. I don't want to say that." The gasps that followed were audible. Even the reporters froze mid-scribble. Jessica's voice continued, now harder, crueler. "If you don't obey, we'll lose everything. You'll never see me again. You'll live miserably with your poor grandmother and your crippled father." The recording ended. The silence afterward was heavy, suffocating. Judge Morales leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable, but his knuckles were white against the armrest. Jessica shot to her feet, her voice shrill and desperate. "That recording is fake. It's edited. It's illegal." Her words tumbled out too fast, each one a thread unraveling her composure. "Your Honor," I said calmly, "the authenticity can be verified. The original file, time-stamped, is on the device. My investigator, Robert Medina, a former forensic consultant for the Chicago Police Department, will testify to its integrity." Jennifer tried to recover, but the ground beneath her had vanished. "Even if it were real," she said weakly, "it's irrelevant to property division." "On the contrary," I replied, "it speaks directly to moral fitness, custodial rights, and the credibility of her testimony." Jessica's father stood suddenly from the gallery. "This is an ambush," he shouted. "You can't humiliate our daughter like this." Judge Morales slammed his gavel. "Order!" The noise died again. The rain outside had started anew, its faint tapping echoing through the windows like the pulse of truth itself. "Mrs. Torres," the judge said finally, his tone grave, "this court will now call the minor, Sarah Villaseñor, to the stand." Jessica's face drained of color. "No," she whispered. But the bailiff was already opening the side door. Sarah entered holding the hand of a court officer. She was small, her hair tied neatly in a ribbon, her eyes red but steady. When she saw me, she gave a weak smile, and I nodded, silently promising that she was safe now. The clerk approached. "Raise your right hand, sweetheart," he said gently. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "I do," she said softly. "Good girl, you can sit." Judge Morales leaned forward. "Sarah," he said kindly, "do you know why you're here today?" She nodded. "To tell the truth." "About what, sweetheart?" She glanced toward her mother, who was trembling now, eyes wild. Then she looked back at the judge. "About what my mommy said." Jessica shot up. "Stop, she's just a child, she doesn't understand." "Sit down, Mrs. Torres," the judge said coldly. Sarah's voice shook, but she kept speaking. "Mommy told me to lie. She said to say I don't want to live with Daddy anymore. But that's not true. I love Daddy and Grandma, I want to stay with them." The courtroom erupted gasps, whispers, even a few quiet sobs. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the relief wash through me like air after drowning. Jessica collapsed into her chair, face pale, tears streaking her makeup. Jennifer tried to comfort her, but she shook the hand away violently. When I looked at Michael, tears were running silently down his cheeks. His hands shook as he reached for Sarah when she stepped down from the witness stand. She ran to him, and he pulled her close, holding her as if afraid the world might take her away again. I turned back to the bench. "Your Honor," I said softly, "the truth has spoken for itself." Judge Morales nodded slowly. "It has indeed, Mrs. Villaseñor." He glanced around the courtroom, his eyes sharp and unyielding. "This court will recess for 1 hour before rendering its decision. But let the record reflect," he added, "that deceit, especially at the expense of a child, will never find shelter in this courtroom." The gavel struck once, hard. As people began to stand, I sat beside my son and granddaughter, my heart still hammering. Sarah buried her face against Michael's shoulder. He looked at me with the weary, stunned gratitude of a man who had been pulled back from the edge of ruin. "Mom," he whispered, voice thick, "how did you?" I squeezed his hand. "Because I've seen monsters wear wedding rings before." He laughed softly through his tears. "You're not just my mom," he said. "You're unstoppable." "Not unstoppable," I said, glancing at Jessica, who now sat slumped in silence. "Just unwilling to lose twice." Outside, the storm broke into sunlight, faint but visible through the rain-streaked windows. The evidence had done its work. The truth, finally, was louder than the lies. When the court reconvened after recess, the air felt heavier, charged with something that hovered between judgment and release. Every seat was filled neighbors, reporters, even strangers who had heard whispers about a fallen wife and a mother who came back from silence to fight. Michael sat beside me, his crutch resting against the table. Sarah's small hand was folded in his, her eyes fixed on the judge's bench. I placed my briefcase on my lap, but this time I didn't open it. The truth had already spoken. My work was done. Judge Morales entered, his robe trailing like a dark wave. The courtroom rose. "Be seated," he said, his tone measured, but his gaze steady on all of us. He glanced down at the papers before him, cleared his throat, and began. "After reviewing all testimony and evidence submitted to this court, particularly the verified recording and the testimony of the minor child, this court finds the following." Each word landed with deliberate precision, like a hammer tapping nails into the coffin of deceit. "The divorce between Mrs. Jessica Torres and Mr. Michael Villaseñor is hereby granted." A murmur rippled through the gallery. "The full ownership of the residence located at 1142 North Maple Avenue remains the sole property of Mr. Villaseñor, as the deed and financial records confirm it was acquired prior to the marriage." My fingers tightened around the handle of my briefcase. The sound of Michael's breath breaking a long, trembling exhale filled the silence between words. "The custody of the minor, Sarah Villaseñor," the judge continued, "is awarded to her father, Mr. Villaseñor, and her grandmother, Mrs. Linda Villaseñor. Mrs. Torres shall be granted supervised visitation, contingent upon psychological evaluation and compliance with court orders." Jessica gasped as if struck. Her face drained of color. Her hands clawed the edge of the defendant's table. "This court also notes," Judge Morales added, voice deepening, "that any attempt to manipulate testimony or coerce a child constitutes contempt of court and will result in further penalties." The gavel came down. Judgment entered. The sound was final, echoing through the room like thunder receding over water. And then silence. For a moment, no one moved. Then Sarah burst into tears. Michael reached for her, pulling her into his arms. He was shaking not from fear, but from something I hadn't seen in him for years. Relief. He turned toward me, eyes wet. "Mom," he whispered, "we won." I smiled, though my throat ached. "No," I said softly. "The truth won. We just carried it here." Across the aisle, Jessica rose unsteadily. Her lawyer, Jennifer, remained seated, her face pale, eyes fixed on the table as though staring into an old regret. Jessica's voice broke through the hush. "It's not fair," she cried. "You can't do this to me." Judge Morales didn't look up. "Sit down, Mrs. Torres," he said firmly. She didn't. "You all think I'm the villain, but he's worthless. You think this old woman is a saint, but she ruined everything." Her words ricocheted off the walls, wild and hollow. "Jessica," I said quietly, standing, "you ruined yourself. I just turned on the light." Her lips trembled. For a heartbeat, I saw something human in her eyes, a flicker of shame, of fear, but it vanished just as quickly. She spun around and stormed out of the courtroom, her heels clacking like a metronome of defeat. Reporters surged toward me, microphones thrust forward. "Mrs. Villaseñor, how does it feel to win?" one shouted. I stopped by the door and turned slightly. "This wasn't a victory," I said. "It was a correction." Then I walked out. Outside, the rain had stopped. The clouds had begun to part, letting strips of sunlight spill across the courthouse steps. I helped Michael down slowly, one arm around him, Sarah holding my other hand. Cameras flashed, voices called after us, but I heard none of it. At the bottom of the stairs, a woman stepped forward, an older lady, with silver hair and eyes full of tears. She took my hand. "Thank you," she said softly. "You reminded us that justice still lives somewhere." I squeezed her hand gently. "It never dies," I said. "It just waits for someone brave enough to wake it." We walked toward the car, the three of us together. Sarah skipped a little, her braid bouncing in the sunlight. Michael looked lighter, as though the weight of years had finally slid from his shoulders. When we reached home, the air inside the house felt different, open, breathing again. The same house that had once held our sorrow now held laughter. Sarah ran to the kitchen, pulling out her crayons, spreading them across the table. "Grandma," she said, "can I draw something for you?" "Of course," I said, kneeling beside her. "What will it be?" She smiled shyly. "A family. You, Daddy, and me." I brushed a strand of hair from her face and kissed her forehead. "That's perfect, sweetheart." Michael watched us from the doorway, leaning on his crutch. "Mom," he said quietly, "I don't know how to thank you." I stood, walked to him, and placed my hand over his heart. "You already have," I said, by standing up again. For the first time in a long time, he laughed, a small, genuine sound that filled the house like sunlight spilling through an open window. Days turned into weeks. The reporters eventually stopped calling. Jessica's name disappeared from the papers. I heard through whispers that William had abandoned her the moment the verdict was public. She moved out of the city, alone. I wished her no harm, only that she might someday understand the wreckage she'd left behind. As for us, the days grew peaceful. Sarah's laughter returned, bright and uninhibited. Michael began working part-time from home, sketching plans for small construction projects, his confidence slowly rebuilding. One afternoon, I sat on the porch watching Sarah play beneath the orange tree. She was building a small house out of twigs and leaves, humming softly. "Grandma," she called, "look, I'm making a home that never breaks." I smiled, blinking away tears. "That's a good kind of home, my love." Michael came outside, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He sat beside me, his hand brushing mine. "You know," he said, "Dad used to say storms make stronger trees." I nodded. "Then we must be an entire forest by now." He laughed, and we sat together in quiet contentment. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops, I felt the faint weight of the years lift. The sound of distant church bells drifted through the air, slow, solemn, but somehow gentle now. I looked at the home around me, the one my son had built, the one nearly lost to greed, and whispered, half to myself, half to the evening sky, "Justice sometimes sleeps, but it never dies. It just waits for brave hearts to wake it." Sarah's laughter echoed from the garden, pure and endless. And for the first time in many years, I allowed myself to breathe. Because this house, the house built by sweat, tears, and truth, had finally become what Michael always promised it would be. A home no one could ever take from us again.